Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday night, which means it's time for a live episode of Iron Culture presented by MASS, the Mass Research Review. I'm here with the good Dr. Eric Helms, who has been traveling. You actually haven't been on the show in ages, it feels like, just because we had pre-recorded stuff, and then there's an episode you weren't on, which is a rarity in the Iron Culture world. So, Helms, how we doing, and how are your travels?
I am doing okay. It was honestly a bit jarring to hear some things that I think, frankly, disappointed, angered, and maybe broke the hearts of some of the Iron Culture listeners with the front page fitness takeover. Um, but we've survived worse, as you know. So I'm not letting it get me down because I had a fantastic time over in Europe. The only downside to it was that I did feel disconnected from the cult, which is why I'm so glad to be back on with you, with them, all of our cultists who join us live on a weekly basis or on each time we have a live episode. But we had an awesome episode with Stian, Dr. Larson. Um, all jokes aside, you and Lauren crushed it, and I think that was a really fun conversation about the science of attractiveness being cool, being good, and all of that. And yeah, no, Italy and Spain were amazing. This is the second year I've now done that, where I've had the opportunity to do a seminar as well as act as a guest judge for WMBF Spain and WMBF Italy. And this time, it also eventuated into a really cool trip to the Techno Gym HQ in Cesena in Italy, which, dude, Trex, it's like the Google campus, you know?
Really?
Um, yeah, dude, it's a 2,500 employee, really cool spot. Um, Techno Gym is obviously kind of like aligned with probably the way you and I see fitness. It's like technology and training. And the cool thing is, if you go all the way back to their history, the company started in 1983, and their first piece of equipment they released was a hack squat,
Beautiful.
right?
Yeah.
So not only the year I was born, but also they were collaborating with bodybuilders early on. They obviously become a much larger brand presence. Many people might know them best as, hey, when I go to a hotel, that's that equipment there. But they have obviously a lot of different ways of reaching out, and I'm just excited that they are getting focused on and have an arm that is now really interested in the bodybuilding side of things. I can't say too much more. They brought me out to leverage my expertise and experience, and I got to see some really cool behind the scenes stuff. But I saw their whole production line, their history. I met their engineering teams. They give all their employees a 2 hour lunch break so they can train in the on site facility, which is an awesome two-story thing. The lunchroom is filled with like stevia sweetened sports drinks and like low fat vegetarian, Mediterranean, pescatarian, vegetarian, whatever you want types of healthy meals. You can get fruits, veggies, the whole nine yards, and it's just like every lifter's paradise if you wanted to go there. And it's just cool. Like they're very innovative. Like you walk around the grounds and they have like a whole outdoor calisthenics facility. They have some things which are hilarious, like they're sitting on balance balls instead of chairs. Some things which are like very, corporate funny, but also fitness kind of involved. And yeah, like they have robot lawnmowers all over the place, you know, and
Just like
it's kind of a
constantly
level of
mowing the lawn?
exactly,
Yeah.
So it felt like a tech company, not a fitness company in many
Hmm.
ways, which it, of course, partially is. So it's a really cool experience, but most importantly, like the generosity, the hospitality, and the interest in learning and education, um, like that doesn't need to be there in a company that size, but it was, which was really cool. Um, and it's still owned and operated by the same two Italian brothers who started it in '83. Even though it is now a publicly traded company, they own the majority shares. So you can tell that their influence is still very much there, which I think is great. It has almost like a family feel, despite being a huge, facility and corporation, and they're very kind of true to their Italian roots. But no, they hosted a really cool seminar that I got to do, and I got to just give people hands-on instruction as well as like a theoretical presentation on exercise selection and biomechanics for hypertrophy. And it was cool. Like I had engineers, people with PhDs, also employees who just liked to lift weights and were able to take the time to attend, as well as trainers. And they did this in partnership with WNBF Italy. So there was like a two-part seminar. So later in the week, I presented after the WNBF Italy Natural Ambassador 2025 show in Milan. So I bounced between Cesena and Milan, judged, and then the day after we did like the nutrition day. So it was a really cool cross promotion, and I had a lot of opportunities to train, hobnob with WBF top pros and judges and trainers, and meet people from Techno Gym, and everyone was super generous and kind with their time. And I was also in the middle of contest prep, and well, I'll ask you, Trex. I won't assume, but would you assume that trying to be on a contest prep while in Italy would be like impossible?
It seems like it'd be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is very much due to what we think of as Italian food in Western communities, which is, of course, huge portion sizes, all very, very pasta based. It's not legit Italian food. Um, Not that that's homogenous. Like Southern Italy is a little more of a challenge, but I wasn't in Southern Italy. And when you're in like Northern or Central Italy, essentially at every single restaurant, you can just look and you'll see grilled or steamed vegetables on like as a side on every single menu, and you'll get cucumber, tomato, eggplant, or you can get what they call pinzimonio, which is just like a cup of raw vegetables. It's like celery, carrots, uh, jicama, and like cucumbers just sitting there like with like a tomato,
What a
but you
tremendously
can just order.
disappointing thing, because I'm sure some people, they're vacationing, they see that on the menu, they say, "Ooh, an Italian word, I'll
It's
order that,"
pinzimonio.
and then they get a
Yeah,
Dixie cup full of celery.
but to be honest, dude, the quality of food is so high there, especially if you go to good restaurants. So like getting the verdure grigliata or the pinzimonio, like it's just vegetables and like grilled with nothing on it, and they're totally fine with you asking, "Hey, can you not put olive oil on that?" It's so good. And then the area I was in, it's coastal, so I could get a grilled whitefish literally anywhere, or shrimp, or any type of very low fat, very high protein, very high quality, locally sourced and caught seafood. And then they bring you bread constantly. So you get to basically opt into the amount of carbohydrates you want, and you don't have to order appetizers or pasta. So like everywhere I went, I'm eating a couple pieces of bread, a crap ton of vegetables, and like grilled whitefish.
Hmm.
And I actually was a slightly bad boy, not in the way you would anticipate with Italy. So shout out to my coaches at 3DM, Jay, Brian, and Berto, who I collaborate with, and we make sure that what I think I'm doing and what is the objective approach is not too influenced by my subjective experience. They were like, hey, when you travel, typically you lose too much weight. You get too lean too quick. You're so active. You're animated. You don't sleep very much. You're up a lot. And we need to make sure that because I'm getting leaner, like we don't have a fat loss spurt, because it'll also be like a muscle loss spurt. So the goal was for me while I was in Spain, the first half of the trip, to keep dieting, but not crazy, and then be on a diet break for Italy. Um, what actually happened was probably like maybe 3 days at maintenance or in a surplus. And then with the step count, how active I was, how excited I was, and probably overcorrecting while traveling and not being able to be as on point with my food selection, I was probably like had three days of a diet break. So I came back and kind of ate at maintenance because I lost 2 kilos while I was away.
Hmm.
And I went from being like, oh, he's in good shape to, wow, you're actually almost in stage condition, and I'm 10 weeks out. So that's not bad. Like getting
Yeah.
in stage condition 4 to 6 weeks out is actually, in my opinion, the goal if you want to reach elite levels of conditioning and eat up into your show. But I almost got there too quick. So, yeah, when I took pictures and video and I sent them to Berto, I was like, oh crap, like I have glute striations now. Like what happened in the last 2 weeks? That was not a diet break. But all's well that ends well. Performance was stable. And I did a good job on every front that I could, and I really had to be on my P's and Q's with trying to adapt to the time zone difference because it's
Mm.
like it's the other side of the world. So I was taking melatonin on the flight
Illegally.
at the right time while I was out there. Not illegal. No, absolutely not. It is something that you can get in New Zealand without a prescription now. That law just recently changed. So
Oh, really? Look at
yes,
that.
just recently changed. I do not have to be an over 55-year-old person suffering from insomnia as of July. MedSafe says now you can actually just consult with a pharmacist. It's not quite over the counter, but they can give it to you without a doctor's prescription.
Did they
So
figure that out because Americans consume about 7,000 kilos of melatonin a year and we're all fine?
I don't know if we're all fine as Americans, but certainly there's probably other causes to our lack of fineness than the melatonin doses
Yep.
we're taking. I would agree. Um, Also, one thing, I had a 10-hour layover in Dubai,
Mm.
and let me just say, Dubai gets the layover award because they have a within airport on the security side hotel with a gym. And you know what I did in my 10 hours, Trex?
Probably got a little bit of sleep and a workout.
How about two workouts, no sleep? Because I was trying to stay up to make sure I got back on New Zealand time on the way back.
Okay.
So I think this might have been a travel prep PR because I was gone for 14 days and I trained 14 times
Nice.
and I trained daily. So I missed not a single workout despite the fact that I had a full 30 plus hour trip out there and back. And I even managed to train in the airport on the way out there when I wasn't going through Dubai. But on the way back, Dubai, I tell you what, bro, I was doing RDLs. They
Wow.
had machines, they had dumbbells. It was awesome. So I'm going to try to fly through Dubai on any chance I get from now on, even if I'm going to somewhere where that makes no sense. Need to fly to LA? Do you want that direct flight? No, I'll go from Dubai to LA. We'll figure it out. Give me 30 hours instead of 12, just so I can train.
That's a pretty cool thing. I think airports, I love the idea of having some better spaces in there. It's kind of insane that, every time, I feel like every time you're at the airport, you see someone who clearly is like trying to sleep on a dirty carpet and they've clearly been traveling for 21 hours and their flight's canceled or delayed. And you're just like, that person's about as miserable as they're going to be, for the next few years. Like this is a low for them. They will recover, but this is a special kind of low for them. So it's nice when airports go the extra mile and give people at least like a place to chill. Like a little sleeping area or a workout area. Like that goes a long way. So props to our
100%.
good friends in Dubai for putting. You said it was a hotel and a gym all behind the security thing where you could just pop right in.
Yes.
Man.
Yeah, because I made the mistake in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong does have an airport hotel, but it's on the pre-security area.
Mm-hmm. So
So
you
when
gotta.
I was flying out, I made the mistake of going through the transfer area and then trying to get to it. And they go, no, 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 you can't exit this area. So if I had just not gone from my flight, because I basically the way I went out to Europe, I went Auckland to Hong Kong, and then I went Hong Kong to Frankfurt, and then Frankfurt to Spain. So if I had gotten off and not immediately followed they're like, hey, go over here to transfer to the international terminal, and just exited security and then come back through, I would have been fine because you don't need a visa to in
Yeah.
Hong Kong if you're a New Zealand citizen. And I could have, gone to the non-security side hotel and booked a session, but instead I had to train. You'll appreciate this. So you know how in airports they got all kinds of crap, right? Huge terminal. They try to block off certain areas, staff only. So they have these portable little barricades that are about hip height. They're just a metal arch and with different, like connecting things to make it stable. And it says, staff only. So I found a corner of the airport where there was no flights going for a while, completely dead, empty. Now I'm sure some security guy on a camera was having a fun time watching this, but they had a bunch of these stacked up together. So I put two of them next to each other and I made a dip station. And I did dips with my backpack on, 3 sets to failure. I did single arm push ups, boom, push day done. And then I also, found a step. I got my backpack on. I'm doing single leg calf raises. Also with that backpack, I tell you what, some sissy squats will hit those quads pretty hard. Bam, got those done. Um, Also, leveraging the data on stretch-induced hypertrophy. I did some hard, long stretches on my hamstrings, just stretching them out. And then I even booked a shower session in the Star Alliance Lounge, which is free. Star Alliance, shout out. They do a great job. I'm an Air New Zealand Air Points member because I fly a lot. And in their shower area, which is quite large, they had this nice hip height step, which I was able to do like single leg squat, like bent over Bulgarians, hit those glutes. Um, you know, I had to I had a 15-minute shower session blocked, so that was a 5-minute shower, 10 minutes of the Bulgarians. You got to use your time wisely. Um, and I did clean the step because I was using my shoes. So anyway, I got it done, Trex. It was a
Yeah.
little weird for everyone around me, but you know what? That's the price of being a bodybuilder.
Yeah, we're very different. I don't like traveling. I kind of hate it. So I recently did a weekend trip to New York, which is a 90-minute flight and no time zone changes. It took me 3 days to recover. I got back and I was like, oh my god, what a disaster, you know. So we're very different. I'm a man who likes my environment the way I like it. I like my stuff, my place, my routine. Any departure from that, whatever's wrong with my brain, I don't do well with travel.
Trex, we're not different. I just bring my environment with me, and at the cost of my respect, reputation, and basically normalcy in society. I mean, there were people occasionally walk by and went, "Is that a guy doing dips on barricades with a backpack?" And I forgot to mention I also found a table and I was doing inverted rows.
Mm.
So I mean, people do think I'm crazy and they're not wrong, but my environment is it travels with me
Yeah.
because I don't miss workouts. I meet my nutrition needs. So I just neither one of us compromise on our eccentricities. We just do it differently.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, hey, I'm glad you had some good travels, and I'm glad that we started with some nice positive stuff here because it's about to get a little negative. I wouldn't say negative. A little. We're gonna fight the negativity. We're gonna fight the cynicism. We're gonna try to be proactive and optimistic and forward thinking about this conversation. But Helms, we might have a problem. Okay. So
Would you say we have a crisis?
some would, some have.
Some would.
So here's the deal, Helms. This is something we don't do that all. You know, sometimes we'll do a little bit of, we'll talk about some of our mass articles, keep it kind of brief, maybe wait till they come out. This particular topic, I think, is too important to be coy about it. We're just going to talk about this topic with depth, and this is going to be an article that I wrote that comes out in the Mass Research Review on August 1st in our new issue. And frankly, it's so important, I'm not going to wait until August to talk about it. I just want to have this chat about it. So the paper that I review in this forthcoming article is by Murphy and colleagues. It's called Estimating the Replicability of Sports and Exercise Science Research. And so the title of my article, Helms, as you alluded to, is Does Exercise Science Have a Replication Crisis? Now, I'm not one to be hyperbolic in my word choice. What I'm referring to is kind of a very well-known, I don't want to say cliche, but it's an established nomenclature. And the reason I say that is because we have seen other fields where scientists basically sound the alarms, pull the alarm, all the panic ensues, and they say, folks, we have it. We have a replication crisis. So there's been little mini replication crises in all different fields. Really, any field could kind of there's no quantified definition where there's grades and you cross over from a problem to a crisis. But really, a lot of it's borrowing from the first well-known publicized replication crisis that came to my attention was in the field of psychology. So I don't know if you heard of any replication crises prior to that, but in that kind of field of, I'd say, like social psychology and some of the peripheral literature that you'll sometimes see in like adjacent like consumer behavior research, things like, you'll see that kind of field that exists at the intersection of like business or economics and psychology. But that kind of field of like, social psychology and decision making sciences, that's an area where people really sounded the alarm back in the day and said, we have a major, major issue. This was, early 2010s. And essentially, people were starting to get the impression, as they're finally going back and trying to replicate some like pretty well known, I wouldn't say foundational, but well established and widely accepted concepts in psychology. People were starting to go back and kind of sniff around at these a little bit and say, well, wait a minute. We've been teaching that in textbooks for quite a while now, but I just tried to replicate it in this study and I got nothing. And that was becoming kind of a broader, expanding consciousness of people saying there's actually like more than a couple things here that we're failing to replicate. So Helms, to give you some examples, one concept that used to be very widely accepted and with very few caveats and qualifiers was the concept of ego depletion, where basically people would say, hey, you've got willpower and it's like fuel in a tank, and it's a very simple and straightforward process by which you deplete your willpower by using it, and once you run out, boom, it's gone. And so that is a concept that, with repeated replication failures, people started to say, this whole concept is way more complicated than that fairly settled science kind of led it to suggested. Another one, which is kind of funny, is if you've ever heard of the concept of power poses. And the idea was that by holding certain poses, chest up, shoulders back, that kind of thing, you would have pretty substantial and pretty allegedly reliable impacts on your confidence level, your hormonal markers, and then kind of downstream effects. You do this power pose, you build up this confidence. There's this endocrine response to this, and then you go forth and perform differently in a variety of tasks. That was another one that really got kind of chopped down to size in the process of the unraveling the replication crisis in psychology. Another one, the concept of social priming, where very subtle cues are said to influence behavior in some pretty surprising ways. That was another concept. Now, I want to be clear when we talk about these. Yeah, go ahead.
I am glad you brought up this one because it's this one is really an interesting one. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work. Mm-hmm. He wrote a fantastic book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is broadly still something I do recommend people read and accurate. And the reason I bring it up is because Daniel Kahneman is someone who has been very vocal about the replication crisis, specifically in social psychology. But even he couldn't get away from it. This is such a widespread issue because he wrote about priming in his book, ironically, while talking about the replication crisis, and he was critiqued for that. And he said, listen, no one's immune to this. This is something that, as we'll talk about, it's unavoidable even when you do things right, and is closely tied to just some of the issues we have in our field with small sample sizes. But anyway, I'm glad you brought that up. And it's a great example of why we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there's still so much good work to be considered, but it is something we need to be highly aware of. But anyway, I'll leave it there. But I would just still recommend people to take a look at Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a great piece of work that addresses the replication crisis while also falling somewhat victim to it, ironically.
Yeah, and Kahneman, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he got a Nobel Prize, right?
He did.
Yeah. So, if I'm not mistaken, someone can fact check me on this, but I actually think, to your point, the idea that, even people who are in the know, very credentialed, not a lot of credentials above a Nobel Prize. I don't know. There's not a whole lot.
Yeah, he's a Nobel laureate.
Even folks who are on top of their stuff and know the game, research-wise, still have to be so tirelessly vigilant, because another thing, this wasn't a well-established fact that fell prey to the replication crisis, but there's a really well-known study essentially about it's called the Hungry Judges study, and it gets brought up in like every pop science psychology book. And the idea was these, they were looking at the outcomes of these cases in a courtroom, and they basically found that the cases that they were doing right before lunch, it was like parole decisions, and their parole right before lunch was just getting denied. Which these are unfavorable outcomes. These are, generally speaking, considered more punitive outcomes for the person who is, whose case is being considered. And so the idea was like, oh, they're getting hungry, they're getting tired, they're getting grumpy, they're being more punitive. And then they come back after lunch and they're cheerful, they're happy, full stomach, and then they're being nice again and, granting all these parole requests. That paper got debunked like 2 months after it got published, because basically what happened was someone was like, these authors just don't know how the legal system works in in the place that they did this study. And so basically the reality of that study, which no one hears this part of it, they just hear the Hungry Judges study and accept it as fact. The reality is the order of cases is not random in the jurisdiction or the courtroom where that was happening. And basically, the people who get stuck at that little time window right before lunch are the people. I think there's like a major confounder. I think it was that they don't have legal representation, or like there was some kind of structural thing where like those cases were not going to be granted parole, like for reasons that were just blatantly obvious and had nothing to do with a growling tummy or being a little tired before lunch. So eventually, like within a couple months, there was a letter to the editor that was like, yeah, none of this really holds up. And it kind of died in the psychology world. But outside of it, in the fun little book you get at the airport, it lives on forever. It's like one of the most well-known studies in recent psychology that got debunked immediately. But the reason I bring it up is that the handling editor, I'm pretty sure, was Kahneman. And I remember seeing that, and it was published in like the #2 journal in the world, PNAS, which is a highly respected journal. So yeah, you could be reading something in a highly respected journal. The handling editor, who ultimately decides publish or not, is a Nobel Prize winner who's well known and well respected, and you still have to be super vigilant with this stuff. You were going to say something?
I was. I'm at the point, Trex, and I don't know if you agree, where anytime I hear a pop anything, like pop psychology, pop social science, pop whatever, my immediate thought is there's probably a grain of truth to that, but I know that it's not actually the way it is because of just how common that controversial, interesting things like that take hold.
Yeah.
And once they get repeated, it's so hard to debunk them. And I've seen it across so many fields. A really common one, which I'll just briefly say, and then, return the mic to you, my friend, is so my wife, she did her bachelor's in an animal behavior related field, and she was a dog trainer for many years, an evidence-based dog trainer. And you've probably heard the whole kind of Cesar Millan approach, dogs are pack animals, you have to be the alpha. And the ironic thing is this is all based upon research in captive wolves, typically in national parks. And what you don't realize is that packs are not really a thing outside of that scenario. They just operate in family units. There's no alpha. There's parents and there's children, and that's it. However, if you take wolves who have maybe like their entire family was killed except for them, like a pup survives, and it is then put in a protected wilderness environment, they form packs. And then once they form packs, they have to decide who's the alpha. And that behavior is a completely abnormal construct for their typical, behavior. And it does not apply to a single or two dogs interacting with human families. And it can work. Like if you intimidate and harass and dominate a dog, it'll do what you say because, okay, boss, but you absolutely don't need to do that. And a better approach is like positive reinforcement and other behavioral things, which have far more support. But it's been repeated like wildfire, like, oh, you got to be the alpha, you got to show them this, dogs operate in packs. And it's not 100% wrong, but it's also not right. And I think that's been the case almost every time I've delved into some of this stuff. Like, also, what's been debunked is the idea of some people are visual learners, some people are kinesthetic learners, and some people are auditory learners. And has much more to do with just what's your level of intelligence, and then what is the concept that you're being applied. Is it something that's very difficult to deliver in an auditory format? Is it something you need to feel? Like, are you a kinesthetic learner, or is someone trying to teach you how to do an RDL with a picture? you
Yeah.
know, like it's
Or like
you know,
you're gonna
and
learn
are you
accounting through an audiobook with no visuals. You're like,
exactly,
I need to
you
see
know,
the spreadsheets. Yes.
yeah. So like those are all things which I've looked into, thought were true, seemed very intuitive, but have been debunked, much like the Hungry Judges thing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, my
carry on.
dad's gonna be pissed. He was a big Caesar Milan guy. Coincidentally, our dogs were never very well behaved. So who knows? Uh, could be something to it. All right. So Helms, listen. Basically, we had a number of these findings. It's kind of like that little thread of the sweater. You start pulling it, it keeps unraveling, and ultimately, some folks in the psychology field put together what they call the reproducibility project. A pretty massive undertaking where they, in a very organized, systematic fashion, tried to replicate a bunch of studies in the field of psychology. And ultimately, they found that their replication success rate was only about 40%, which is not what you want. I think a lot of folks who are just kind of passively interested in research, hashtag trust the science, all that kind of stuff. If you ask them what percentage of published research in a given field do you think successfully replicates, I'd venture to say most people are giving you a number that starts with a 9, right?
Mm,
92%, 96%. And so in psychology, it was just nowhere near that number. Obviously, this is going to vary from field to field. There's some stuff, you put together a mathematical proof, that's probably going to work no matter who's doing it, right? Unless you forgot to carry the one. But, same thing in chemistry. If you tell me that this thing reacts with that thing and creates a third thing, you probably tried it a few times and, you probably sorted that out. It's not to say there's no failure of replication, but different fields have different kind of implied success rates, even when things are functioning properly. But for psychology, 40% was the number, and they all kind of collectively said, that's not high enough. We need to do some stuff. So, Helms,
Trex,
yes.
can you define replication? Because I think many times people who are not in the know, I'll put it this way. There's a big important distinction between something that is positive and something that is null versus something that flips from positive to negative.
Yes. Let's see here. Yeah. So the I'm gonna try to pull it just straight from this exercise science paper because I like the way that they kind of defined what they were considering
Yeah.
uh, a success. So they basically, if you can give me a second here, I'm gonna try to find where I scratch or jotted these down here. Why don't you give your best definition of it, and then I'll swoop in and say, well, actually, and correct you with some of the direct quote here, so I don't bungle it.
Sure. Well, I think I'll protect myself from getting actually and just provide some important context that we are going to probably dive into more deeply is that when we are dealing with fields that aren't math or chemistry, we are inherently dealing with samples of a population to try to estimate a given effect. And even when you do everything right, it's really important to understand that there's going to be variability in response. And we've talked about this previously when we talked about sampling error, or what's probably better categorized as sampling variance, is that if you are dealing with insufficiently large sample sizes and also measurement error that may or may not be able to be minimized, and a small effect, like you might in sports science specifically, some of our in-house uh, modeling estimations we did of like how do you find a zero point 0.2 effect size if that's real in a population of 100,000 people with n equals 20 samples, 9 out of 10 of those should be a null, and then one should be positive if you assume a certain degree of between study variability, which is, subjective, but can be reasonably well informed by the data that exists in the field. So in that case, if you have a study which, due to the file drawer effect, where people only publish positive findings, or maybe due to maybe liberal stats interpretation of using the one that gets you the lowest p-value possible, the first publication is positive, you would expect the next 8 to potentially be nulls. And even if there is a real effect. So I think it's just really important to understand that, the replication crisis, in quotes, when you're dealing with some of these issues in our field, it is not necessarily something nefarious or a complete malrepresentation. It We need to both consider not only was there a statistically significant effect, but also the size of the effect. And that's something that I think is really important. And I think, as you read into the definition from this paper, they considered is the magnitude of effect, which is going to really have a large influence on quote unquote replication.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the, not just the direction of the effect, but the size of the effect. So one thing I should have mentioned is the psychology replication project. They found that their success rate was only about 40%, I think I said.
Mm-hmm.
But the average effect size, the typical effect size, you have the original one, and then you try to replicate it. The replication effect sizes on average were 50% smaller. So even in the cases where you would say, oh yeah, both showed a significant improvement in outcome X, in a lot of cases they were saying, yeah, but it was like 50% smaller than the effect size that was originally reported. So here we go. So in this sports science paper, they said, we consider a study successfully replicated when it was significantly different from the null. So basically meaning, okay, the original study found a significant effect in a given direction. This study did too, so that was the first part. And the effect sizes were not significantly different from each other, and the effect sizes were compatible with each other. So it's not just that they were saying is A different from B, but they actually did kind of more like an equivalence testing approach, which is
Mm-hmm.
more relevant to the question, and saying, statistically speaking, effect size A and effect size B, we're not just asking are they different from one another, we're asking are they actually, can we functionally consider them to be approximately equivalent? Doesn't mean they're the exact same number, but with all the statistical procedures, you're accounting for the fact that we expect there to be some variance and stuff. But yeah, basically what they're looking at is, to be a successful replication, there's a significant effect in both of them going the same direction, and those effect sizes were compatible from a statistical perspective. Now, they also had something called an informative failure to replicate. So that was a situation where there was either the effect size was not different from null or in the opposite direction from the original, but the replication effect was significantly different than the original effect size, right? So basically, after that, they talk about a practical failure to replicate, which means both are significantly different from the null, and there is a replication effect size that was significantly different from the original effect size, or an inconclusive outcome where neither effect size was statistically significant relative to the null, and the replication and the original effect sizes were not significantly different. So that's a mouthful, but basically in an ideal scenario, you want to have a situation for a successful replication where you say, okay, the original found this effect, the replication also found that effect, and the effect sizes that they both report are ultimately compatible. But you can't have some of these like in between situations, right? So maybe you find a situation where this one said there was a significant large effect in the positive direction. The replication said kind of a small, almost significant, but not quite significant effect in that direction. Or maybe both of them had a significant effect in the same direction, but when you actually compare the effect sizes, they're not fundamentally equivalent. One was a massive effect and one was like a moderate effect, right? So all that is to say, there's a lot of gradation when it comes to replication. And just because you say a study failed to replicate, that does not imply, for example, in study A, there was a large positive significant effect, and in study B, there was a large negative significant effect. Like we're not talking about completely inverting the effect. We're not saying like this one had a huge effect and this one had an effect size of literally 0. There's a lot of gradation, a lot of different types of replication success or failure. So again, they have success, they had informative failures, they had practical failures, and then they also had some of those inconclusive studies as well. So a lot of different possible outcomes. Now, Helms.
I visualize this as kind of going, all right, let's say there's a bell curve distribution of an effect, right?
Yeah.
And we put a piece of paper in front of it. This is just two pieces of paper, right? And one is blocking the other. When we do small sample size studies, it's essentially like taking a paintball gun and shooting through that first piece of paper and doing it from 50 yards away, knowing that this isn't a rifled barrel and that it's going to go through and hit it somewhere. And each time you do that, you're getting one little glimpse at what is the overall bell curve effect. And you can think about, okay, if the bell curve effect is the size of an 8 by 11, piece of paper, and you've got a dime-sized ball that you're shooting through it, unless you hit dead center of that bell curve multiple times, which is unlikely to happen, by chance, it's not going to be until you've emptied a lot of that clip until you really know what's going on in the real world. And if you shoot to the far left and the far right, you're going to have something that quote unquote doesn't replicate, even though you're still sampling an accurate assessment of that effect in the population. So that's just I think an important piece of context, because a lot of people, when they see Replication Crisis and saw Replication Crisis, their response was, we need to bin the entire field of social psychology. And I think that's something you hear without even this paper in sports science among people who are highly science critical. So I just think that's important.
Yeah. And so what you find, to kind of put a more practical spin on these definitions, which are not like super intuitive, and the definitions, if you're not into null hypothesis testing, it's very jargony. So obviously, you have a successful replication. That's pretty simple. Basically, the conclusion is, hey, effect size A and effect size B, the original and the replication attempt, these are ultimately compatible with each other. They're showing the same effect in the same direction with approximately similar magnitudes. One step down from that, there were studies that they found to be inconclusive that were not deemed to necessarily be incompatible. So what that means is like, the original study was, this large statistically significant effect. In this case, we did a replication, and the replication, was not a significant positive effect, but it also wasn't significantly different from that original effect size. So it was kind of in the middle of like, not necessarily significant in the same direction, but generally going that way, and not so far off from the original that those two effect sizes are different from each other. So those were instances where they would say like, okay, well, we didn't replicate it successfully, but this wasn't like a total disaster. It's essentially inconclusive. But then when we get into the practical failure and the informative failure, those are the ones where you would look at it and say, okay, like we are essentially seeing effect sizes in the original and the replication attempt that fundamentally are not compatible with each other, statistically speaking. And so, Helms, if I could just briefly summarize kind of the high-level findings of this paper, and then I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about the ramifications, because the findings of this are eye-opening. There's some numbers that jump off the page, and you say, whoa. And I think it's important to share those for effect, just to kind of really hammer home this is substantial stuff here. But a lot of the stuff about replication is researcher to researcher talking, right? And so what are we going to do about this, I want to make sure that we spend a lot of time telling people, as the consumer of research, the consumer of information, what do you do about this? How do you move forward while all the researchers are talking about how we're going to fix this over the next 10 or 15 years, right?
Yeah. I think two things. We need to give them those highlights, and then people need to know why is this happening, and then what should they do about it.
Yeah. So in this project by Murphy, this was a big replication project, just like the psychology one I mentioned previously. That psychology one, as a reminder, they had like a 40% replication success rate, and the average effect size was 50% smaller when they tried to replicate those originals. In this case, before you even get into the data, it's worth noting that they ran into a lot of challenges. So, for example, they started out kind of determining what studies would actually be suitable for a replication attempt. They very systematically set up their inclusion exclusion criteria, did a search of these, and they what they did was they looked at top level, kind of top quartile journals, so the best 25% in terms of quantifiable quality, so to speak, to the extent you care about those metrics. But what they were doing is saying, let's go to the top quartile of journals in this field, and let's look for papers between 2016 and 2021. And so the top quartile basically is saying, hey, we're not trying to cherry pick here. We don't want to go to like the crappiest little like pay to play journal that'll publish anything. There's been journals, that not in our field that I've seen, but, pay to play journals that will literally publish like a generated movie script, and you'll say it's a paper about chemistry, and it's just like dialogue from a Seinfeld episode. So they were looking at top level journals, and 2016 to 21. That's important because it basically says, okay, we can judge them based on contemporary standards and expectations of research methods and quality. Also, there's a better chance we can track them down, right? You don't want to grab a paper from 1954 and say, hey, can you send your original data? Like, you don't even have the technology required to derive that data. Like, unless it's written down on a notepad. Like, I had some colleagues back in the day who there was like a whole production in the lab because we needed to get data off of some floppy disks. It was like, how are we going to do this? So we had to like figure out how can we actually access the technology to get data off of a set of floppy disks, which was quite a conundrum, but ultimately they succeeded. But anyway, recent papers, top level journals, and initially, they kind of whittled it down to a selection of like, these are kind of our, the ones that might make the most sense. There was a complicated process because they had to go and get potential people to actually do this, right? It's not like a group of 5 people. It's like, yeah, we're going to go replicate 50 studies. They had to get this long list of potential collaborators and then match them up with studies that would actually be suitable for their skill set, their lab space, their equipment, all that kind of stuff, right? So they had to say, here are studies that make sense to try to replicate, and here are specific labs and authors who are up to the task of replicating specific pairs of these studies. So some of the issues they ran into initially, they got a terrible response rate when they whittled it down to kind of a list of hopefuls for studies. One of the first things they did was send out an email saying, hey, we'd love to get your raw data so we can recalculate some things and ultimately help with our power analysis and things like that. They weren't trying to like find fraud or inconsistencies. It was just like, hey, you didn't report all the things we need for us to do a really good job here, so we'd love your data if we could get it. The response rate was terrible. So that alone is kind of a big problem, which, number one, data that was published less than 10 years ago should not be impossible to track down. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to point out it's easy to think that this is a uniform reason why people aren't responding. Like, oh, I did some bad data practices, I don't want to be exposed, or I'm lazy. But I'll give you an example. At AUT, for non-health data, which typically sports science falls underneath it, we are supposed to destroy the data 6 years later.
Yeah.
We also, unless we explicitly specify in our ethics application that the data can be used for future research, which we have to disclose to the participants, and which often gets rejected or asked to be amended if we don't have a specific purpose for it. I guarantee you right now, if I put an ethics application, in case someone wants to replicate this, they'd say, nah, adjust that. So that means if they contacted me for a study in 2024 that was done any earlier than 2018, the data's destroyed. Second, even if it wasn't, my ethics application specifically states that I could not give them that raw data. And that is independent of the fact that I, as a researcher, believe in the open science movement and and it's only gotten harder with data sharing agreements and things like that. So this is an uphill battle that has systemic and administrative issues, not just um, crappy sports scientists who don't want to be exposed for p hacking.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, like a lot of folks, and this is an issue with the field rather than the individuals themselves. I think there's very few people who are really that concerned about like, oh, if I send you my data, you might snoop around and find that I made a mistake or something. There's like this almost 0% of people who are like, I know I did fraud and I don't want you to out me. And then there's a smaller percentage that's like, I'm not a statistician. It makes me uneasy to have people picking around in there because what if I made an honest mistake? That's bad for me. Again, that's a small percentage. But the vast majority of instances, I would guess personally, number one, like you said, Helms, logistically, administratively, it's a nightmare trying to share data. And a lot of universities make it prohibitively difficult because they don't want you to share it. Because let's be honest, Helms, they don't
Yep.
care about the field that you're in. They care about the liability of data security. That's it. It's not more
Yep.
complicated than that. Um, I know a lot of people, their heart is breaking because they believe in the enterprise of higher education as this noble pursuit and the ivory tower and so on and so forth. But a lot of them are hedge funds that also run classes, and they have a multi-billion-dollar set of assets to protect, and they don't want the liability where they don't need it. So that's just a reality. On top of that, Helms, if someone says, "Ooh, I like this paper on creatine from the good Dr. Eric Trexler," I'm going to drop him an email. Um, if I were the corresponding author on that paper, I wasn't. The stuff I published as a grad student. Some PIs have their students serve as the corresponding author. Some don't. Uh, if my advisor had, said, "Yeah, you're the lead author. You should be corresponding author," I can't access anything going to that email address anymore. So anyone who published like at an early career job or a grad school paper, you're trying to email me at Ohio State, you're trying to email me at UNC. I'm not getting that. It can't, and they won't let me forward my emails from those old addresses. So like, I bet a lot of people they were just emailing folks at wherever they did their postdoc, and it's just going to an email address that doesn't even exist anymore. So again, it's just like structural things where this isn't like individual level malfeasance. This is like, as a field, what are we going to do about this? Like, we,
Hmm.
we need to be able to contact people for at least a handful of years after papers get published, and it should be easier to share data that, let's be honest, a lot of sports scientists are being held to data sharing agreements that are made for like cancer trials or like genetics trials where they're like trying to high level sensitivity stuff
My
that is
centimeters of jump height are not sensitive health data, even though we're
correct.
treating it
Yeah.
that way.
I give you a height, weight, a body fat percentage, and a vertical jump. You're not going to deduce who that is. And even if you did, all you could say is, hey, nice jump. It's not that big of a deal, right? So that's another problem is, again, universities are managing these and trying to create one set of guidelines that applies to their cancer researchers, their genetics researchers, and their sports science researchers with fundamentally different types. And they're man, people doing qualitative stuff where the people are admitting to
Yes.
crimes in interviews and stuff. Like, bro, there's different kinds of data, and they need to be handled very, very differently. So, I was talking to someone. This is a funny conversation. I was talking to someone who was their job was they were an archivist. They managed the archive at a university, and there was a Nobel Prize winner who did some genetics research, and this individual wanted to have their notebooks as kind of like a historical thing, uh, preserved, digitized, and made available. And they were like, "Brother, you were doing genetics research in like 1958, and the stuff you wrote down, like, first of all, the IRB would have canned you like day one. Like you should not have been getting this data. But it was like the Wild West back then, right? And they're like, we cannot digitize.
IRB? What's that in 1958?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
they're like, brother, like the things in your notebook will literally tear apart families. Like you're reporting the genetic information of people who think this is their biological dad, and it's not. So like we cannot do this. So anyway, all that is to say, data privacy and security and sensitivity varies a lot. And unfortunately, in exercise and sports science, we find ourselves in a situation where we're publishing bench press creatine studies, and they're putting us through these very overly protective data sharing protocols. So anyway, for all those reasons we mentioned, data sharing, a lot of whiffs in terms of trying to get some responses. I think the number was below 20% success rate of getting those responses. Another thing they tried to do once people were kind of tentatively paired up to do these replications, they were like, hey, why don't you go ahead, email your plan for your replication protocol to the original author and just say, hey, we're going to try to replicate your study. Here's our approach. Here's our plan. Here's our sample size. Want to get your feedback, see if there's anything that you think is good, bad. Should we change things? What do you think? And again, with that round, very low success rate in terms of getting substantive feedback that they could really apply. They're basically almost as like a courtesy saying like, I'm going to try to replicate your study. Here's what we're going to do. Thumbs up, thumbs down, feedback, balls in your court. And a lot of people just didn't respond. And then of the small percentage who did, it was about half of them said, yeah, looks good. Half of them said, no, doesn't look good. And that was kind of it. So then another hurdle they ran into before we even talk about the data is, I mentioned, they tried to get some raw data sharing, not very good. Tried to get people to give them the thumbs up on their protocol before they actually did it. Again, not very good success rate with the responses. They started with 189 people who said, yeah, I'll do a replication study, match me up and we'll take care of it. And of those 189 collaborators, only 33 of them actually got to the phase of starting a trial. Only 29 of them finished a trial, and then only 25 of them achieved adequate sample sizes to have usable data. So we're whittling down from 189 to 25 in the final data set.
So like 15% or something.
Yeah. So from my view, one of the really interesting things about this study is before anything really went down, we're already getting some interesting insights about, frankly, a field that is not functioning well. Like, and that's just putting it bluntly, but and that's not me like pointing the finger at people. That is me saying we are all embedded in a field that right now is not structurally set up for success. If we cannot pull off these kind of projects with higher success rates with data sharing, protocol approval, and then actually initiating and finishing these trials, we have a lot of problems. And these are structural problems, not individual problems. Now, Helms, obviously my mass article is coming out August 1st. People who are really want to dig into the details can find a lot of data there, a lot of statistics. But I do just want to hit the absolute high notes here because these are kind of the numbers that everyone's going to be on the edge of their seat looking for. So we actually get these 25 trials done that we can use data from. How'd it go? Ultimately, only 28% of these studies achieve that threshold where we would say this was a successful replication attempt, meaning, the original study found a positive significant effect, so did the replication, and the effect sizes were statistically compatible with one another. For the other 72%, either it was a failure or it was one of those like you certainly didn't succeed here, but like we mentioned, there's varying degrees of failure. But ultimately, for those other 72%, the replication effect sizes were not statistically compatible with the original effect sizes that were reported. And on average, the replication effect sizes were 75% smaller than the originals. So, Helms, I've been doing podcasting. I've been in the biz for a while, talking about this field and studies in it and research in it, going back to 2018, 2019-ish. And we collectively, I think folks who are, kind of people who really like to nitpick the studies have been saying for a while, like, we got some issues in the field, and, we would talk about the psychology replication project as kind of a cautionary tale of like, we may have some of the same stuff going on, and more than likely we do. But at the end of the day, it's probably not accurate to kind of put them up apples to apples. Different projects, different timelines, etc. But at the end of the day, if you did want to go apples to apples, our field had a lower replication success rate, and our effect sizes were more inflated compared to the replication project that was taken or that was conducted in the field of psychology. So Helms, I think at this point, it's probably a good time to pivot toward, why did these things
Why?
happen, and ultimately, what do we do about it? So when it comes to like why we would have such poor success rates and why we would have so much shrinking of the effect sizes when we replicate, there are many, many different contributing factors. And in the article, there's so many of them. I just said, like, listen, I'm not going to lay out some kind of grand unifying theory of everything here. I'm just going to, in no specific order, lay some stuff out, right? So first of all, exercise science research, generally speaking, we're trying to measure fairly small effect sizes that generally take a while to materialize, right? So we're thinking, a study of trying to measure muscle growth in trained people over 8 or 12 weeks. That is not a very easy thing to do. So in many cases, we're measuring these small effects over way too short time scales using measurement devices that have, observable error associated with the measurement. The outcomes, those small effects that we're measuring, are often confounded by a million variables that are outside of our control. There's going to be, some people who are just genetically more prone to muscle growth than others. We try to allocate them as best we can, but we're doing small studies. It's groups of 8, like we
Hmm.
can't really hang our hat on random distribution of different genetic propensities when we have groups of 6 or 8 people per group, right? And so we've got these small samples, which means we're going to have a ton of sampling error or sampling bias. Like I said, small effects over too short of timelines with too small of samples, with measurement devices that have plenty of error. And so in many cases, we really are kind of setting up our studies in a way where we're trying to find a needle in a haystack. And oftentimes what you'll find is when you have these kind of small studies and the effect size isn't much different than the error of the measurement device itself, you're going to find a lot of, if you redo it 100 times, you're going to find a lot of very gross overestimates of the effect size and a lot of very gross underestimates of the effect size. One effect that's been noted across many different fields of science is that people tend to publish the big ones first. When you
Yep.
get the study that has a really big effect size, oh my God, look at this. That tends to be the first study that really gets published and makes waves. And across many different fields, there's a well-known phenomenon where the effect size for a given phenomenon starts high and over time drops to what is a little bit more close to an approximately true effect size or true average effect size relative to the populations that it's been measured in. One of the things that we're also fighting against as a field is, these studies, we do them. We know that we're going to have a ton of sampling error because the sample sizes are small. These studies take so much time and effort and money to run. Like if you've never run a training study, but maybe you're a personal trainer, just think through it for a second. Like it's important
Yeah.
to take a moment to think through. If you were a personal trainer, imagine that you were going to have, I did a training study during grad school with 80 participants. I think it was actually north of 80. So you're thinking, okay, I'm going to train 80 clients 3 times a week. I'm going to do that for 12 weeks. And that's just to get the data, right? That's,
Yep.
like when you start thinking of the remarkable number of hours, the person hours that goes into that type of study, it really is just nauseating to think about from an efficiency standpoint. And so obviously, people do a study. A lot of times the reaction in our field is, oh, thank God somebody else did it. Great. We don't think, oh, time to replicate it, because it's just such a huge effort to do that. And so there are, there's many other, are there any ones that you can think of, Helms, that I've left off? Any low hanging fruit there in terms of And of course, a couple other things I should mention as I invite you and then cut you off. Uh, there is very little fraud that happens. That's a thing. We've seen glimpses of it. Not common, but it is a thing that exists. A very, very, very small contributor. On top of that, one of the issues, Helms, I think, is I talk about in my article, as a field, we don't get very good statistical training. We just don't. And you know, one of the reasons, I mean, there's a million reasons for it. None of them are very interesting, but at the end of the day, a lot of exercise science programs are offshoots of other programs that aren't really quantitative in nature. So a lot of times it's like a little, offshoot of like a physical education program, for example, where the curriculum just was never designed to be, a huge statistical thing, or it's a little offshoot of biological sciences. And even in biological sciences, historically, because they do so much experimental control, their stats aren't all that flashy. You look at a biology paper or like a basic human physiology paper from 1986, t-test and ANOVA, boom. Into the 90s, they just weren't doing a lot of. It's not like in the social sciences where you have to have these giant, super complicated models with all sorts of crazy theory that had to be worked out over the decades. We evolved from fields that do simple stats, and one of the things I mentioned is you could make an argument. I don't like the argument, but you could make an argument. It makes no sense to train exercise scientists with all these really intricate and fancy statistical techniques, because at the end of the day, we're still doing studies with 10 people in each group. And what you find is the more complicated the statistical models get, the more subjects you need in your study to actually be able to do anything useful with it. You could go and become, an expert in all this, structural equation modeling and all these, different offshoots of, all these different complicated statistics. At the end of the day, you got two groups with 8 people each. What in the world are you going to do other than a t-test? You got nothing to work with in terms of statistical power. So those are the low-hanging fruit that jump out to me. Helms, anything that I missed there?
No, I think, but a side commentary and a callback, I think is worthwhile. Remember how we discussed the Brian Wansink replication that I
Yes.
wrote about in Mass,
Yeah.
maybe 30, 40 episodes ago, maybe longer? I think that's a great example of the gradations of what could be construed as fraud, or at the very least malfeasance. People are probably reasonably well aware of, I'm going to say, that people have accused Barbalo or Wilson of fraud. I'm not saying that we're doing that. But there are notable instances in our field where those few people who have actually just fabricated data, or have been suspected to fabricate data, have come up. So they're real. But much more common are things like that. So for those who don't know, Brian Wansink actually kind of straddles both fields, really. Like nutrition, with some occasional influence of exercise, but also social psychology. He had the endless soup bowl study, where they essentially just hooked up a tube to the bottom of a plate so that it would constantly refill this plate with soup, and then saw how much people would eat. And the replication was semi-successful of this one study, and that they found a smaller effect, but they needed a larger sample to find it. But a lot of Brian Wansink's work is very accurately described as harking, p-hacking, or just very shoddy and sloppy research methods, and pushing for quantity over quality and over extrapolating on results due to the kind of publish or perish environment and the high pressure R1, ironically, kind of environment that often comes in those institutions. So I think this is just something to be aware of, that much like there are gradations of reproducibility, there are gradations of what I would consider poor practice among researchers, from consciously cutting corners to not realizing that you're cutting corners because you haven't been trained in stats, to active fraud
Yeah.
and everything in between. And I agree with you. I don't think it's a justifiable claim to say we shouldn't train researchers in stats, because I think exercise scientists not being familiar with stats is the cause of some of the structural issues.
Yeah.
Like the standard G-power assessment of what is my sample size is based upon something that is fundamentally wrong, but the average sports scientist couldn't tell you why. It's going, okay, assuming we're going to see a large effect size, how many people should I need? When we actually, if it, and I think scientists know this, but they can't explicitly connect it to that G power sample size assessment, going, oh, wait, they're assuming a zero point 0.8 effect size, but the effect of training is zero point 0.3 something. The
Right.
effect of protein is zero point 0.2 something. Should we be assuming that? Or maybe should we use some type of different sample size justification? And that lack of training is, it goes up to, okay, the journal editors sit there and go, well, we want to be good scientists and have a sample size estimation, but because I am fundamentally ignorant about the basics of stats, I'm going to put forth a bar that actually perpetuates some of these issues. That's an
Yeah.
example where the training would be helpful.
Man, you're gonna get me going here. We're already running pretty long in this episode. Now, it is tricky because, like you said, like a lot of folks who are at higher editorial positions are the folks who have been in the field for a while, right? They're not going to be the ones necessarily innovating statistically in a field that has shied away from statistical innovation for the entirety of their careers. And so you did see some journals that started to embrace this stuff. I remember in grad school, getting comments on a paper. It says, you need to justify your sample size. And I said, I measured a football team. The sample size is the number of people on the team. Like, you have no idea why you're telling me to do that. You're not thinking about it in the context of the study. Like, yeah, there's so many instances where people say, like, I heard you're supposed to do this, so now we're going to mandate it in a journal. And in a lot of cases, it leads authors to, like you said, just kind of fiddle with some kind of sample size power calculation that then people read it and say, I guess this is what you're supposed to do. I don't know. I didn't get trained on it. And then people kind of mimic that. And yeah, we end up getting a whole body of literature where, there's people who are pretending to do a sample size estimate when it's like, bro, you clearly just measured a team because that
Yeah.
was your research question, had to do with that, within the context of a team, what do we observe? And then you'll find, everyone assuming, like, if we just assume that caffeine's effect size is 4 times larger than it is, then all we need is 9 people. And it's like, well, okay, but
And the knock on effects are even more problematic because, as we established earlier with sampling variance, okay, you do your sample size calculation, you assume a large effect, you get your 8 people, and then you happen to be the 10% of studies, or sorry, you're in the 90% of studies where it's null. That's not a big deal. If you're in the 10% where it's positive, most of the time it hyperinflates the effect size, and you do observe a large effect. And now you're like, listen, I did the sample size, I've got enough, I observed a large effect, p less than 0.05. This is real and this is generalizable. Yes, caffeine is anabolic steroids, you know? So it's like, or not, that's a bad
and
example, but
then
caffeine is methamphetamines.
yeah,
And the conclusions in the discussion are written in a way that describes that as a real generalizable effect and over leverages those findings, when in reality we need to just be assessing each data set as a piece of the whole and getting, as a field, comfortable with the idea of each one of these small sample size studies is just fuel for a future meta.
yeah, and Helms, this is kind of another effect of that, which really highlights why just getting better statistical training, even if you're not going to use it in your specific niche of research, is such a big deal. Because Helms, like, let's say, for example, we're going to go with that example, caffeine studies, 8 people per group, just these little tiny ones where we know some of these studies are going to dramatically inflate the effect size. Some of them are going to dramatically underestimate the effect size. They're going to find a negative effect of caffeine. It's just sampling error. This is basic stuff. So we know that we're just using the shotgun approach. We're going to spread those pellets all over the place and try
We're
to figure
shooting those
out
paintballs at the paper.
figure
Yeah.
out where the middle is of this scattershot distribution of effect sizes. But what often happens, both among researchers and people interpreting fitness evidence, is they say, okay, there's 3 papers on this topic. They're all dramatically underpowered. We know for sure that this is just a scattershot approach. None of these individual effect sizes are in and of themselves reliable or valid, or we can't really hang our hat on it yet. We don't know where the middle of this whole thing's supposed to be anyway. And one of those studies was done in team sport athletes. One of them was done in totally untrained people. The other was done in trained lifters. And the one random one that ended up getting the super high inflated effect size just by chance was the one in untrained lifters. And so everyone says, well, clearly this works in untrained people, but it can't work in team sport athletes, and it certainly doesn't work in highly trained athletes. But we could reshuffle that deck, and we may find, oh, it only worked in the highly trained athletes. But team sport athletes, they're not trained enough. And, of course, untrained people, they're not going to get an effect. And so you can see how we start trying to fill in the blanks of this scattershot approach and say, well, what is it about the sample size? Or, oh, these folks did the intervention for 10 days and they only did it for 6. For some reason, it worked in 6 days, but maybe after 10, they habituated to it and it didn't work anymore. And it's like, no, you're over-interpreting nonsense. And if we had better statistical training, then people would be able to kind of pump the brakes and say, I know that we have 3 studies on this, but based on the way they're designed and based on a reasonable estimate of the effect here, we just don't really have anything yet. Like, I mean, we have slightly more than nothing, but we're nowhere close to a meaningful answer in terms of how we use this.
What's the saying? To the man with a hammer, all problems are a nail. And to the credit of exercise scientists, what the training does do well is we typically get well mentored on how to do accurate assessments on force plates, with ultrasound, with body composition. Whatever you're trained on, you were probably trained well, and you're an excellent collector of data. And when you see a methods paper and that the findings are off, you're not going to go to the stats section and be like, oh, let's see what kind of precision they were working with and uncertainty and what was the reliability. You're going to look at, did they do this wrong? And if they did, or if they didn't control for certain things, that's the cause, because that is the thing that I know you did wrong. But they don't actually understand, like, all right, well, what is the true error that's going to be introduced from having someone come in at 8 a.m. versus noon for DEXA? Does that really explain the entirety of the difference? Or is it possible that because we had 10 people, we are just looking at sampling variance? And you're right, the narratives that form start to even create additional problems when we need to not try to actually over leverage any kind of narrative or hypothesis, because we can't know what confounding factors might have influenced it.
Yeah. And other confounding factors that I just thought of that I didn't mention, one of the things that comes into play, especially in training studies, if the person who's doing the stats or the person who's doing the measurements was in the gym and is essentially unblinded and is expecting, oh yeah, the people in the high volume group, they're going to have thicker muscles. Ultrasound, you try to standardize it the best you can, but ultimately a millimeter of extra pressure changes the measurement, right? Same thing goes for even just the people giving the intervention. If they're going to be unblinded because they know what's on the sheet, this is the high volume day or the high intensity day. And a lot of times the people are giving verbal encouragement. And are you subconsciously getting more out of the training sessions of the people in the group that you expect will be more effective? There's all these kind of unconscious biases, both in terms of applying the intervention and measuring the outcomes, that ultimately can introduce some bias. And that is another fairly substantial potential reason for failed replication. And a great example of that, Helms, is there was a horse named Clever Hans, a classic story. So back in the day, because you hear about like, oh, we can't replicate your study, we think you're a fraud. That's kind of the natural jump people do. But there's this guy, and he's like, listen, I got this horse. This is like the smartest horse I've ever seen. He can do basic mathematics. He can spell some words. And people are like, no, he can't. Your horse can't do math, man. And he's like, yes, he can. And so this guy, his horse, he'd take him out and he'd say, do 2 + 1. And the horse would, pound its hoof 3 times and then look at the guy like, yeah, I'm done. He said, okay, did I just do the wrong math verbally? Whatever.
No, you were perfect. Okay. 2 + 1 does equal 3.
Okay, good. I started rolling with the sentence and I was like, if I mess up basic arithmetic, this is not going to look good for me. But no.
No, I got you. I'll make sure you replicate.
And then, he said, okay, do 5 - 2, 1, 2, 3. Do 2 plus 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the horse is doing it. He's getting it right. And then people are baffled. They're like, this horse can actually do math. This is crazy. And then eventually they're like, okay, you go away, to the guy who owns the horse. And then they do it. They go, all right, Hans, give me 2 plus 6. And he just stares at them like they're a bunch of idiots. No hoof, nothing. And they're like, "What? Come on, Hans, do." Okay, he doesn't like that one. Do 5 minus 2. Nothing. And so basically what was happening was the horse was responding to completely unintentional cues it was getting from the owner, these kind of anticipatory cues. And the horse had kind of learned, when he's all like excited and clenched up and hoping that I'm going to stomp my hoof, he really likes it when I stomp my hoof. And when he kind of eases up and says, "Oh my God, he really did it," I should probably stop then. So it was just a total anticipatory effect. The horse was reading kind of the vibes and the body language he was putting out. And it was a situation where that guy who owned the horse was not lying. He was not even wrong. He just didn't understand exactly what was happening. And ultimately the horse couldn't do math. And so we may see things like that in a world, a research paradigm where you're in there doing the intervention, and if the outcome is reps to failure, and you really think this was supposed to be the one that works, like, might you actually encourage people to get that extra 1.5 reps on average? You absolutely could.
I'll give you an example of this. So for my PhD data, we did data collection at FAU on an auto-regulated study. So they were selecting loads based upon their prior session to hit a certain number of reps at a given RPE. And I had some competitive people in there who had some of their friends in there. And, we do our best to maintain participant confidentiality, but we got 5 ER racks running simultaneously, and people are telling each other, "Oh, are you doing the study on squat and bench and RPE?" "Yeah, me too. Cool. Yeah, I'm in there on Thursdays at 4. "Yeah, me too. Actually, no, I'm coming in at 5. "Oh, those are your numbers that I see on the board." So, we would write out, "Here's what you did last week," on the whiteboard in front of each rack, so that they didn't have to look through their logbook. We're making it easier for them to select loads. We had to stop doing that because I had a participant who I noticed seemed to be choosing 2.5 kilos more than the guy who came in at 3. And I come to find out they're trying to compete with each other. And he's not selecting RPE appropriately. And it became so apparently obvious. I'm like, oh my God, like this specific participant is not choosing, like, if you fell within the RPE range of 7 to 9, you could choose whatever you want. And he was choosing something 2.5 more than the last guy. And then he was doing the opposite. And I was like, all right, I need to erase the board. Very and we're moving quick. We got stopwatches, we got spotters, we got some people doing 1RM testing. So yeah, I left, some white marker stuff that I should have erased on the board from the prior session, not thinking he's going to recognize participant 12. Right. But they had talked.
Yeah.
So now I have to purposely erase it, and I had to talk to the participant and be like, "Listen, I get it, and I'm glad you're motivated." But that's the type of thing that what if I hadn't picked up on that, Trex,
Yeah, and what if you hadn't picked up on it, for sure? And then also, there are a million little things that happen in studies like that, or like, that when you did post testing and this was a performance study and all we have is pre and post and it's reps to fatigue, and you look at the kid and you say, "Bro, you told me that you did all the criteria for what you're supposed to do in the last 24 hours, but like, you're hungover. You just are."
Yep, 100%.
It's a 22-year-old kid. Or, "Bro, I'm looking at you and you clearly have been doing like all-nighters every other night for that big biochem exam. And so whatever performance metrics I get out of you cannot be representative of the actual nature of this study." And so then the question is, what is the correct, appropriate thing to do? Is it to remove their data from the study or to not remove their data from the study? And then you have pierced the veil of what is a very uncomfortable conversation, which is not letting the data lie. Like, in terms of just letting them rest. You collect it and it is what it is. But, over the course of doing studies in this, research of this nature, you may hear about lab groups that are a little bit more enthusiastic about getting their fingers on the data. And in their mind, they're saying, "I'm eliminating confounding, biases from people that were not following, pre-exercise guidelines. It's like, well,
Protocol.
did you actually confirm that they didn't? Or are you going off of a hunch? And to what extent is that hunch actually reliable? So all that is to say, like,
And are
it's
you uniformly removing the data? Because like
exactly
the assumption is like, hey, that's not a problem because that type of thing should be randomly distributed between groups because we have large enough samples.
right,
Oh, wait a minute. What did you and I just talk about a second ago, Trexler? We don't have large enough samples. So when
right,
you start proactively removing people and it potentially like yeah, like what if there was two other guys competing in the other group that I didn't see?
yeah.
That's it's a
and and
you get
like
what I'm saying.
and you kind of you hope that every time that happens, there's going to be a section in the paper that says, by the way, two participants in this group showed up hung over because they had a bachelor party the night before post testing, and one participant in the other group clearly hadn't slept in 3 days, so I removed their data. But hey, I've read a lot of exercise science papers. I don't see a lot of that. And so, obviously, generally, the ideal scenario is you set really strict criteria. You do very, very good screening of did you adhere to these guidelines? If they say no, say, are you sure? I won't be mad. I just really need to know. And you have the criteria so there's no decision to be made, right? All
Yeah.
the decisions are made before you recruit the first participant. Here's the
A
criteria.
priori.
We rigorously figure out if you violated it. If you did, we remove it. That's it. But all that is to say, when you look at this literature and you say, how could the replication success be so low? There's a million different little things, and the only way to really fight our way out of this and increase that replication success rate and close the gap between original effect sizes and replicated effect sizes is going to be getting out in the open of what are the challenges we face in this kind of research, what are the best practices, what are the standard operating procedures, what are we expecting in terms of reporting, and ultimately what are we going to do to train our researchers to be more systematic with the way we do these things, because ultimately that's what it really comes down to is a lack of that systematic, well-trained application of what we're doing. And so that really is, if you're wondering what's the secret, that's it. We need to systematize everything. Training needs to be ramped up, and it should be the type of thing where if you really are well-trained, doing things by the book, and everything is dictated in a systematic way that's very clearly reported, anyone should be able to replicate anything with the understanding that we're going to have some sampling error and modest differences from study to study.
So Trex, that's
Yeah,
on us. We as a collective representative of science and our colleagues, we're going to deal with that. And now
yep,
we've we've overfed that fed horse, as the saying should be.
hmm
What do the practitioners? What are the evidence informed, hopefully, lifters or evidence interested lifters? What do they do with this information? Do they throw out? Is the well poisoned, or how can they use science still, or should they be at all?
yeah. So I would say that the way I put it in my article is that for some people they're going to hear this and their jaw's going to hit the floor and they're going to feel queasy and get that cold, clammy sweat going and say, everything I've built my training around for the last 4 years is a lie. I'm completely unmoored. My faith is shaken or just completely shattered. But there's a lot of folks in the fitness world who are going to read this and say, yeah, that makes sense. And I think, Helms, that's where you are when you read this paper. That's where I am. It is a touch low. I would have expected anywhere between 25 and 50% replication success to be a reasonable expectation. Down close to the bottom end of that's not encouraging, but again, it's also a small sample of replication attempts, so we have to apply that too. All that is to say, if you've really been following stuff, like if you've been listening to Iron Culture for a while, if you've been reading the Mass Research Review, if you've been following the Helms, Trexler et al., our kind of network of people that make content for a while, this stuff is frankly vindicating in a way, because we've been saying for years, we've been talking about the value of a meta-analysis. Why don't you just choose your favorite paper from that literature and say, this is the best one, I'm going to base my understanding on this one? Because of all these things, all the different areas of study, Helms, where a study comes out, we get flooded with 50 DMs about it on Instagram, people saying, should I change my whole life over this new study? And we commonly say, well, Why don't we wait and see how it does with replication attempts? Let's see some more research in this area. And I think to a lot of people, folks would say, you guys do boring stuff. You're you don't hype up the stuff that's really hot right now. You don't go attack things that, based on one study. You don't hype them up based on one study. The approach we take is not sensational, fairly boring, very measured. And we are, in many cases, Helms, as you would often put it, late adopters, specifically when the risk of getting it wrong is substantial, right? So if there's a training intervention that says, hey, if you stretch between sets, it may help, and it's the first of the topic, and we see no reason to believe it would be detrimental, and maybe it's positive, and the worst thing is that instead of resting for 90 seconds, you did 30 seconds of stretching in the middle. What do I care? Go with it if you're excited about the paper, right? But if we're talking about stuff where we're not sure of the health effects, this could be a huge waste of time and effort. It could be obscenely expensive with no gain. It could actually hurt your gains. Those are the areas where we say, why don't we wait and see how this replicates? Because based on our knowledge and training of how this stuff works and our training in statistics and whatnot, we've been looking at this literature for a long time and saying, clearly the replication rates are not going to be high. And that is ultimately why we always are saying we need replication. We need hopefully soon to get a meta-analysis so we can start, working our way through what a typical effect size is in this literature. So the takeaways ultimately are not that different from what we've been saying for years, which is that when it comes to new research, we have to be very cautious, very deliberate with our interpretation. We need to dig into the details, and we need to resist that temptation of jumping straight to this is amazing or this is terrible. And to be honest, Helms, one particular topic that this is going to feel like a jab or a shot across the bow, and it's not because for reasons I'll get into, but the lengthened partial stuff, when it first came out, there was like one or two really exciting papers, and it got just so fast to the point where people are like, wait a minute, why were we ever doing training with full range of motion? Like that's ancient stuff. The dinosaurs were doing that. We're way past that now because of innovations of science. Now everything we do is lengthened partials. And I was like, I don't know. And it did make me a bit grumpy because that's my natural reaction. I was like, let's just pump the brakes because, probably what we're going to see is that the original, kind of really exciting effect sizes, as we get more data, it's likely to kind of shrink. And, I think Helms, something that we'll agree on here on this topic is not only are you with replication, and not just like direct replication, but just more research on the topic, different permutations and arrangements of how we address that question, you're not just finding what is the one true effect size, you're finding in what scenarios is this more or less effective. And that is a particular area where I think with lengthened bias training and lengthened partial training, with more studies, we get more color that we fill in and say, oh, okay, well, it makes sense for this exercise, but not that exercise because of where the exercise is most challenging. And it makes sense when you're doing this past failure for this exercise, but in this case, doing lengthened partials and just regular full range of motion, you're going to get to the same place either way. So what we have found with that literature is when you give it a minute, let a couple meta-analyses come out that do some subgroup analyses or some moderator analyses, see how the intervention is tested in different contexts. Ultimately, you start to say, okay, there is merit to this. I don't deny that. However, the initial hype was, I think it's fair to say, pretty overblown. And when we start to really get a clearer picture, we start to say, oh, the utility of this is very conditional based on how it's being applied, which totally makes sense for any training intervention, right? So again, this is the kind of stuff that I think we've been preaching for a long time about, taking it slow, deliberate, and cautious with your interpretation. But at the end of the day, it is worth really reiterating this and stating the obvious. The science in this field is very imperfect, but it's still some of the best stuff we got. Like it is,
Yes.
It can't be overstated how invaluable it is. Like we do not want to go back to the days of the only source of information being, I heard it from a strong guy, or I tried it, and as far as I can tell, it seemed better than what I used to do. We can still use those, but it's really, really valuable to be able to funnel that through cohesive, aggregated summaries of research with objective measures that actually quantify the things that we want to know. It's way better to start with the science and use some of those other anecdotes and personal experiences to fill in the gaps and kind of build our understanding of those anecdotes and experiences through the prism of what we've learned from science. That is still by far the preferable way to go. So I know some people are going to see this study and throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, I guess exercise science is done. It's useless. It's always been terrible. There's nothing good. That's not an appropriate interpretation. An appropriate interpretation is that exercise science in the aggregate on a topic still gets us where we're trying to go. But when we start getting into that nasty little trap of interpreting one study here and one study there and believing them at face value as being purely true sources of information that are robust and valid and will never be overturned or questioned, that's where you start making mistakes.
100%. Couldn't have said it better myself, and I'll just use an imperfect analogy to drive the point home. If reading this shakes your faith in the utility of evidence-based practice, and you go, you know what, I'm just going to go back to what I did before and rely on the anecdotes and the collective wisdom of the lifting community, that's essentially finding out that you thought your airbag and your seatbelt would protect you in 80% of collisions completely, and you find out it'll only completely protect you in 20%. So you say, fuck it. You don't wear your seatbelt, you disable that airbag, and you start speeding and drinking while driving.
Yeah.
And you go, and there was no point to that. That is not a perfect analogy, but it's pretty close, because everything that we describe which impacts small sample size research is infinitely multiplied, and there's no hope of determining causality when you're dealing with N of 1 or even N of groups from well-controlled, well-meaning, good job, excellent evidence-based kind of coaches reporting on what they find in aggregate. We're basically chopping off the top of that evidence hierarchy instead of going, oh man, this evidence hierarchy, yeah, they can theoretically determine causation, but they're so limited that we actually need a bunch of these RCTs. And a lot of these meta-analyses are actually even too small in terms of the number that are included, and they're done wrong. So we need to be looking at the most recent meta-analysis and then evaluating it, and then just understanding that it only gives us an idea of a relationship. It doesn't tell us what to do on Tuesday. So frankly, a lot of people out there, if you want to take the evidence and use it directly for your practice, you need to understand those things. And I know that most people are simply not going to be doing that on their own, and they're going to be looking to people to follow. And the things I would encourage you to do is that if someone is making definitive claims about research, they basically need to be ticking 3 boxes. 1, they need to have a basic fundamental understanding of physiology, just so that they kind of understand how things work generally. 2, they need to actually have a lot of in-the-trenches experience with whatever topic they're talking about that is being researched, so they can understand the difference and the limitations of when you're doing even translational or applied research relative to the real world. And then finally, and this is the really high bar to clear, and this could easily be interpreted as me saying you should just listen to Trex and I, because I know not a lot of people fit this bill. They need to have read 90% of the research on the topic they're talking about. Because I can tell you, just like Trex actually correctly, accurately identified, because I've read almost every single paper, full text, that's been published on lengthened quote-unquote bias training, shortened partials versus lengthened partials, whether it's isometrics, exercise manipulation, resistance profile manipulation, what have you, and go, yeah, 80% of these papers have null effects, 20% have positive, none have negative, and here are the instances where we consistently see null effects, which muscle groups and why. And I can give you a pretty cohesive narrative of what I think will be true, and I'd be surprised if I was wrong in 5 years when we do start getting some of these first meta-analyses. But I think even someone who's read half of those papers would not be able to. So when you're following someone, please do follow multiple people. Not everyone has to clear that bar, and not everyone needs to be giving you that type of advice. But if you want to really take what they say to the bank, then you need to make sure they're reaching all three of those criteria. And there's equivalent things you can do that'll get you really close on your own, reading position stands, recent meta-analyses, and following kind of a handful of people who are both in the trenches and can give you advice that is not specific to the research, but definitely tried and true, useful anecdotes, and also actually looking at some of the top people who are publishing in a field who are statistically well trained and aware of meta-science. And that'll get you really far, and at the very least, it'll prevent you from doing things that are completely bonkers. But when you see somebody on TikTok who is just hasn't been in the game long enough or in the right way, who is giving very confident assertions that seem research based, you just really need to assess whether they're high up enough on Dunning-Kruger to be convincing, but not to know that they're wrong, and you not to be able to assess whether they're a true expert or not.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of riff a little bit off of that, I mean, I I hate the words that are about to come out of my mouth because they sound a lot like gatekeeping, but what I've found over the years in the evidence-based fitness space is that there is an inverse correlation between the amount of time you've spent doing actual research, like in the lab, observing the collection of data, the planning of studies, the whole process. The more you've done of that, the less you come out with definitive single paper declarative statements saying, well, now we know that this is the case because look at this new study. And so I don't want to be the person who says like, hey, you have to go do 6 years of mentored research as a grad student and then go, do more research after that as a postdoc or go start a lab in order to talk about this stuff. That's ridiculous, and I don't want to live in that world. I think it's good that we have open dialogue and discourse about these studies and people care about them. That's a huge privilege. In Helms, we know people that have done research in, frankly, less interesting fields that other people do not care about. Like, that's just objectively true. There's a lot of people who do research in fields where if they mention what their dissertation was on at a party, people go, huh. And then they say, please don't tell me about it. Yeah, I actually have to go to the bathroom again. Didn't you just go to the bathroom? Yes, I go often. Bye. Whereas, Helms, you go to a party and say, oh, yeah, I study exercise and nutrition. You get hit with 70 questions. I heard this thing about beetroot juice. Anything up with that? What's up with this apple cider vinegar? You get all of it, right? So I like that people have that dialogue, but honestly, like when people are coming out with, like you said, the overconfident, forceful kind of, here's what the research says, and it's very obvious what it means, and we know this for a fact. More often than not, a lot of people that are doing that kind of content have too much faith in individual studies because they have not spent enough time in a lab to know all the different things that can go wrong, and then all the different things that just from a probability perspective ought to happen in research of this nature. And Helms, just to kind of reiterate one thing that you said,
or they go the other way and they reject it all because of the
yeah.
limitations, and
Yeah.
they go the full cynic route.
Yeah.
And nary anything in between.
Yeah, exactly. And what you find is that people who have spent a lot of time, dedicating like chunks of their life to this research craft, is they're not on either extreme. They know it's useful because they've seen the proof in the pudding, but they also know it's limited. And there are a million caveats, and you have to interpret so carefully and so cautiously. And so that's something to keep an eye out for out there. But Helms, you talked about the idea of like, if this totally dashes your confidence in evidence-based practice, then blank. I'd want to add one additional perspective on that, which is that if seeing this dashes your confidence in exercise science research, your confidence in exercise science research was inflated from the start. It was you were putting more confidence in it than a researcher would have advised. And that's a really tough pill to swallow. But again, it comes down to finding yourself in that middle spot where when one study comes out on a topic, a researcher who's trained in doing this stuff is not going to say, well, it got published. It's a fact, and so I think a lot of the folks who are going to be really deflated by this and really have like an existential crisis of how they're going to train on Monday, a a lot of those folks, without knowing it, were actually placing way more confidence in some of the literature than would have ever been advised by someone who actually does the research, right? They kind of,
or intended. Yeah.
yeah, they kind of were fed a perspective of what science is and how you implement it that is not actually justifiable and not actually rooted in our more formal understanding of how science works. So it's messy, it's dirty, it's imperfect. But the nice thing is that with more repetitions, you take more cracks at it, it gets better over time. And a lot of people, the way they talk about it is it's not about being right today, it's about being incrementally less wrong over time in perpetuity. That kind of is the practice of doing science, and exercise science is no different. So this is great because it's the first step. The first step is admitting you have a problem, Helms. And so this kind of paper is something where exercise scientists collectively say, I was hoping to be 48, not 28, but we knew this was how things were going to be. And so now the question is, how do we get together, move forward, and ultimately deliver more reliable effect estimates in our future research? And I'm sure we will. But for the meantime, the tool that we all have to rely on is very thorough and cautious interpretation. And it's a beautiful art. It gets frustrating at times because it's slower than you like it to be. But Helms, what else are you going to do?
You just got to keep your head up. And on that note, to end on something positive, Trex,
Keep
before
your head
we
up
sign
and
off.
hit your power poses. Head up,
Yes.
chest up, shoulders
Keep
back.
your power poses. Absolutely. And take heart that Ronnie Coleman's okay. That's
Yes,
the
quick
update I
update.
wanted to
Yeah.
leave people with. Yep. He had sepsis. So it was actually which is bad news. That can quickly overwhelm someone's immune system and result in death, but he is okay.
Yeah.
Ronnie's strong movement is going well. There was a period of time where he was in a medically induced coma, as I understand it,
Man.
unconscious and being treated, but he is good to go. He is back recording, and he looks like he's in the clear. So, exercise science crisis averted. I have the same confidence because we averted the Ronnie sepsis crisis. So we're all going to move forward together. Everything is going to be okay.
Yeah.
We'll not let the darkness consume us. Don't let your existential dread overtake you, folks. It's all going to be okay.
Yep. Well, I'm glad to hear that. We love Ronnie. He'll always have a special place in my heart. Those old NO Explode ads, man. That's a formative memory for me as a lifter. All right, Helms. Thanks so much for joining me. Nice long episode. Your first time back in a while. So of course we were gonna, take it easy and really explore the space here. So glad we got a chance to kind of chat. And hey, we'll be back next week with another episode. Before we go, though, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Sorry we didn't get to any questions in the live chat. We'll be sure to do that very soon in the near future. But we very much appreciate everyone who joined us live. If you like the show, a lot of ways to support: like, rate, subscribe, review, share it with a friend, spam it all over the internet, give it a 5-star review, submit questions after hours. You can go to massresearchreview.com/ironculture and submit questions, which we sometimes answer on the show. Of course, the number one way to support, everybody knows it, become a member of the Mass community. The Mass Research Review comes out the first of the month. Every month we talk about stuff like this, and frankly, here's the shameless sales pitch. When we know that a large portion of the literature will not replicate, we have to really dig into these studies and figure out how in the world do we make sense of these findings relative to other literature, and how can we move forward and apply it in a practical sense. I hate to be shameless about it, but this is ultimately what the Mass Research Review is all about, is saying, hey, we know we can't just take this study at face value. You see a new study about high volume training. The goal is to not print out table 2 with the training program and say, I guess this is how I work out now. The goal is to actually integrate that, synthesize it, and form a cohesive understanding moving forward. That's exactly what you get with the Mass Research Review. And Helms, the good Lord knows how many times in that research review we have very diplomatically and very not suably said, hey, I know this paper's making the rounds. I have zero faith in it. I have no confidence. This will never replicate. Please adopt the following perspective as you move forward. It's come up many a time in the Mass Research Review. We always do it in a way that's very diplomatic and productive, but at the end of the day, these kind of replication failures kind of reiterate essentially why we do what we do with the Mass Research Review.
And folks, you got to protect this man, because in the halls of mass, for no authorship, this guy has recalculated at least 5 meta-analyses that were done incorrectly and published them in the appropriate way within mass over the last 5 years. So just, you know what? He deserves your subscription.
Absolutely.
Eric Trexler does alone.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
When my days are behind me and I hang up the spurs, I trust that someone will lift a banner in a garage or a warehouse in my name. You know, kind of retire my jersey, so to speak. A little lab coat with my name on it, lifted up to the rafters. All right, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. We love you. We will be back in 7 days with another episode. Until then, take care.